Talk to Me. Danny and Michael Philippou's Talk to Me premiered in 2023 and quickly earned its place as one of A24's strongest modern horrors. The setup is chillingly simple. A group of Australian teenagers pass around a preserved embalmed hand that lets them talk to the dead. Grip it, say "talk to me," and a spirit appears. Say "I let you in," and you're possessed. The only rule is 90 seconds. Cross that line and the spirit doesn't leave. At first, the film treats this ritual like a game. The kids film each other on their phones, laughing as their friends thrash, shriek, and speak in voices that clearly aren't their own. The movie lingers on these moments, the candlelight flickering, the camera catching wide-eyed reactions, the sense that they've found the ultimate party trick. But then Riley, the youngest in the group, tries it. What starts as fun turns into the film's most brutal scene. Possessed by something violent, he slams his head into a desk over and over while his sister and friends scream, unable to pull him away. It's a moment that flips the tone completely. The hand isn't just a thrill anymore, it's a curse. From here on, the story follows Mia, played by Sophie Wilde, whose grief over her mother's death makes her cling to the hand even as it destroys the group. She's convinced she hears her mother's voice through the ritual, and that need for connection blinds her to the danger. The spirits twist her memories, blur her reality, and leave her isolated from everyone she cares about. The film works because it never reduces possession to a simple scare. It ties the supernatural to real emotions, grief, addiction, and the desperate need to belong. It's a film hunted down by ghosts. They invite them in, again and again, until the cost is too high to ignore. By the final act, Mia's choices leave her trapped in the very cycle she thought she could control. X. Ty West's X, released in 2022, is both a slasher throwback and a sharp commentary on youth, aging, and desire. Set in rural Texas in 1979, it follows a small crew of aspiring filmmakers who rent a farmhouse to secretly shoot an adult movie. They're full of energy, chasing fame and money in an era where sexual freedom feels like rebellion. But the property's elderly owners, Howard and Pearl, see something very different when they watch the group of strangers. The first half of the film feels almost ordinary. The crew films in barns and bedrooms, their cameras capturing staged intimacy under grainy lighting. The contrast is deliberate. Life and vitality in the foreground, silence and decay lurking in the farmhouse just behind. And at the center of it all is Pearl, played in dual role by Mia Goth, whose presence grows more unsettling with each scene. She stares at the young women with longing, touches them when they don't notice, and yearns for the youth that has slipped away from her. The violence doesn't erupt immediately. It simmers until Pearl's resentment and desire boil over. When the killings begin, they're blunt and shocking. No elaborate setups, just sudden acts of rage filmed with the same unflinching realism as the crew's movie. The horror isn't about a masked villain stalking teenagers. It's about watching age, loneliness, and envy twist into something feral. X stands out because it explains horror through contrast. Youthful ambition collides with the inevitability of aging. Sexual freedom is met with repression and bitterness. The crew believes they're making art that celebrates life, while Pearl sees it as a reminder of everything she's lost. The result is a film where sex and death share the same scene, and the scariest thing isn't the violence itself, but the reminder that time comes for everyone. Pearl. Released just a few months after X, Ty West's Pearl acts as both a prequel and a character study, showing how the quiet old woman from the farmhouse became a killer in the first place. Set in 1918, it follows Pearl, a young woman stuck on her family farm, caring for her paralyzed father under the strict control of her mother. She dreams of escaping to the movies, of dancing and performing, of becoming someone the world admires, but the reality around her is stifling. Isolation, war, and the Spanish flu that looms in the background. From the beginning, Mia Goth plays Pearl with a mix of innocence and menace. She sneaks away to watch films in town, whispers her desires to farm animals, and begs for more than the life her mother has forced on her. Every interaction carries that tension between a girl with childlike dreams and a woman boiling with resentment. The farm itself becomes a prison, wide open fields that feel suffocating because they never change. The violence builds slowly, then cracks open. Rejected, humiliated, or ignored, Pearl lashes out. The murders aren't masked with mystery, they're brutal outbursts of a woman who can't reconcile her dreams with her reality, and West makes the audience sit with her instability. The most famous moment is an unbroken monologue where Pearl confesses her jealousy, lies, and rage. It goes on for minutes, and the camera never cuts. By the end, her smile stretches into something unbearable, as if she's trying to freeze joy on her face while her mind completely unravels. Pearl works as horror because it makes ambition itself frightening. It explains how wanting more, when constantly denied, can twist into violence. The film strips away supernatural elements and shows that the scariest monster in X wasn't born out of mystery. She was shaped by isolation, repression, and a dream that curdled into obsession. Saint Maud. Released in 2019 and directed by Rose Glass, Saint Maud is a psychological horror that builds its unease from obsession and faith. The story follows Maud, a recently converted Catholic nurse assigned to care for Amanda, a once famous dancer now bedridden with terminal illness. Maud appears quiet and dedicated, but beneath that calm, she believes she's been chosen by God to save Amanda's soul. The film lives in Maud's perspective, and it rarely lets the audience step outside of it. Everyday details become charged with meaning, a flickering light, a whisper of wind, or the sudden silence of an empty room. Maud interprets these moments as signs, proof that God is speaking directly to her. She sees Amanda's lack of faith as a challenge, almost a test, and becomes convinced that she alone must guide Amanda to salvation. But Amanda resists. She mocks Maud's piety, laughs at her intensity, and treats her zeal as something ridiculous. This rejection pushes Maud further into isolation. Alone in her small, bleak apartment, she punishes herself physically, convinced that suffering is a part of holiness. Her visions grow more vivid, blending reality with hallucination until even the audience can't separate the two. The climax is brutal in its restraint. Maud, believing she's completing a divine mission, commits violence in God's name, and the final scene reveals the horror of what she's truly done. Saint Maud explains horror not through jump scares, but by showing how faith, when twisted by loneliness and guilt, can become indistinguishable from madness. It's an A24 hallmark, turning something deeply human into something terrifying, and leaving you questioning whether the scariest part was the supernatural at all, or the devotion of someone desperate to feel chosen. In Fabric. Peter Strickland's In Fabric, released in 2018, is one of A24's strangest horror films, a surreal mix of haunted object horror, consumer satire, and dark comedy. At the center is a single red dress, cursed to bring misfortune and death to anyone who wears it. The first half of the film follows Sheila, a lonely bank teller navigating life after a divorce. Hoping for change, she visits a department store during its January sales. The store itself is uncanny, mannequins posed in unsettling ways, saleswomen who speak in archaic, almost ritualistic phrases, and an atmosphere that feels more like a cult ceremony than retail. When Sheila buys the dress, it seems to offer confidence and allure, but it also carries something else. From then on, the dress becomes inseparable from tragedy. Washing machines break down violently, dates go wrong, accidents escalate into deadly events. The dress itself seems indestructible, surviving burns, tears, and stains without losing its color. Each new owner inherits its curse, and the pattern repeats, desire followed by destruction. The film's horror isn't only in the dress, but in how the department store operates like a machine feeding off consumer longing. The clerks feel less like employees and more like cultists, guiding customers into rituals disguised as sales. Strickland shoots it with dreamlike imagery, close-ups of fabric swaying like living skin, mannequins in positions that feel disturbingly human, and store rituals that blur into outright occult ceremony. In Fabric explains horror by tying it to desire. The dress is never just clothing, it's temptation, the promise of change, beauty, or escape, followed by inevitable punishment. The result is less about a killer object and more about how easily ordinary lives can be destroyed when desire becomes blind devotion to what's being sold. The Witch. Released in 2015 and directed by Robert Eggers, The Witch marked A24's breakthrough in folk horror. The story is set in 1630s New England, where a Puritan family is cast out of their settlement and forced to survive on the edge of a dark forest. That opening alone sets the mood, an ox cart rolling away, the gate closing behind them, and silence swallowing them whole. At first, it's the ordinary hardships of farm life, barren fields, a sickly harvest, and a family barely holding together. But then the infant disappears. Thomasin plays peekaboo with her baby brother, looks away for a second, and he's gone. The film cuts to a glimpse of a figure in the woods, and suddenly it's not just survival anymore, it's fear. Eggers builds tension through authenticity. The dialogue is pulled from 17th century journals, which makes every prayer and accusation feel heavy with conviction. The mother, played by Kate Dickie, clings to faith as her grief turns to suspicion. The father chops wood until his hands bleed, his pride cracking along with the family's trust. And Thomasin, the eldest daughter, becomes the focus of their whispers. Maybe she's the witch. Maybe she's the reason for their downfall. The goat Black Phillip steals scenes quietly at first, just wandering the yard. The last shot of her rising into the air, surrounded by a coven, is both terrifying and strangely liberating. The Witch works because it isn't just about the supernatural. It's about isolation, repression, and how quickly fear can rot a family from the inside. Whether you see it as a story of hysteria or one of real witchcraft, The result is the same. Once the forest takes hold, there's no way back. Heretic. Scott Beck and Brian Woods, the duo behind A Quiet Place, wrote and directed Heretic, which premiered in 2024. On the surface, it starts quietly. Two young Mormon missionaries, played by Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, knock on the door of a wealthy-looking home. Inside they meet Mr. Reed, played by Hugh Grant, who greets them politely, almost warmly, but the longer they stay, the more it becomes clear that this house is a trap. The film works by flipping expectations. At first, Mr. Reed seems like an eccentric man indulging in conversation. He offers drinks, asks questions, and slowly begins to peel away their sense of safety. The missionaries try to remain polite, as their faith teaches, but every change turns sharper. The questions shift from small talk to morality, from surface level to invasive, until they're cornered in a psychological game they can't walk away from. The house itself feels like part of the snare. Wide open rooms are shot in ways that make them look claustrophobic, hallways stretch into shadows, and doors always seem to close just out of frame. Every attempt to leave is delayed by Reed's persistence, his charm bending into menace. Hugh Grant's performance is the anchor here. He plays Reed with a mix of theatrical flair and genuine menace, a man who enjoys testing others until they break. By the final act, Heretic shifts from a dinner table debate into outright survival horror. The missionaries realize faith and good manners won't protect them, not when their host has turned every principle they cling to into a weapon. The film doesn't rely on cheap scares. It builds dread out of a conversation, the kind that starts civil but ends with the realization that you've walked into someone else's doctrine, and there's no safe way out. Heretic explains horror by showing how belief can be twisted when used as a trap. It's less about demons or the supernatural, it's more about a human predator who turns faith into the sharpest blade in the room. The Lighthouse. Robert Eggers followed The Witch with The Lighthouse in 2019, and it's one of A24's most strikingly strange films. Shot in black and white on a nearly square aspect ratio, it traps the viewer in the same cramped isolation as its two leads, Thomas Wake, the older keeper played by Willem Dafoe, and Ephraim Winslow, the younger man played by Robert Pattinson. The premise is simple: two men sent to tend a remote lighthouse, but the execution turns it into a descent into madness. The film lingers on repetitive routines: scrubbing floors, hauling coal, eating meager meals under Wake's drunken toasts. The sound design makes every creak of wood and every shriek of the foghorn feel like an assault. The isolation presses down until even time itself stops making sense. Conflict builds between the two men. Wake is domineering, forcing Winslow into endless chores while jealously guarding the lantern at the top of the tower. Winslow grows resentful, his sanity fraying as he hallucinates mermaids, sea monsters, and visions of violence. The imagery is surreal, often blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Tentacles slipping across the floor, a storm that never ends, and drunken arguments that collapse into physical fights. The film's climax leaves interpretation wide open. Winslow finally reaches the light, his obsession fulfilled, only for the beam to overwhelm him. He screams, consumed by what he sees, and the story ends with his broken body left to rot, picked apart by gulls. The Lighthouse is horror as obsession. It explains how isolation strips men down until the only thing left is power, desire, and madness. Whether you see it as myth, allegory, or simple cabin fever, the result is the same: two men, cut off from the world, devoured by the light they were meant to protect. Hereditary. Ari Aster's Hereditary, released in 2018, is often called A24's most disturbing film, not just because of its shocks, but because of how it turns family grief into something cosmic and inescapable. It begins with a funeral. Annie Graham, played by Toni Collette, buries her secretive mother, and from the start there's unease. Whispered stories about what the old woman was involved in, strange faces at the cemetery, and a daughter who seems more connected to the grandmother than anyone realized. The family tries to move on, but grief cuts differently for each of them. Annie buries herself in her miniature art, recreating scenes of her life in painstaking detail. Her husband Steve retreats into silence. Her teenage son Peter withdraws, and her young daughter Charlie sketches and builds odd figures out of trash. The house feels heavy, every room stuffed with shadows and unfinished conversations. Then tragedy strikes again. A party, a nut allergy, a car ride, and Charlie is killed in one of the most shocking sequences in recent horror. From there, the family spirals. Annie lashes out at Peter in a dinner table confrontation that feels more terrifying than any ghost scene, her grief boiling over in rage. Peter is haunted by visions of his sister, and Annie turns to a neighbor who teaches her how to hold seances. The rituals seem comforting at first. A glass moves, a candle flickers, and Annie believes she has found a way to speak to her daughter again. but the door she opens refuses to close. Shadows move, words appear in notebooks, and the house itself begins to feel like a stage set for something bigger. By the time the truth comes clear, that Annie's mother belonged to a cult, and that every death has been guiding Peter toward becoming the vessel for the demon Payman, it's too late. The ending is blunt and unforgettable. Peter left alone, his family gone, his body no longer his own. The cult members bow. The film closes on a coronation as if all of this suffering was just a necessary step in a larger plan. Hereditary works because it makes horror inevitable. It explains grief not as healing, but as a trap. Every attempt to process loss only feeds the larger plan, until the family realizes they were never in control. Green Room. 2015 brought Green Room, a film that felt less like fiction and more like a worst-case scenario unfolding in real time. A struggling punk band takes a gig at a remote Oregon bar, the kind of place where the swastikas on the crowd's jackets tell you this was a mistake the second they walk in. The setup is fast: play the set, get paid, leave. But when one of the band members wanders backstage, they find a dead body. Just like that, the green room door locks, and the group is trapped with people who cannot afford to let them leave alive. The room itself is part of the terror: peeling paint, humming fluorescent lights, and the suffocating awareness that the crowd outside is waiting. When Pat pushes the door open and his arm is hacked into pieces, the camera doesn't cut away. It forces you to sit in that moment, the silence broken only by his shock and the chaos around him. Darcy, played by Patrick Stewart, is the calm at the center of the storm. No shouting, no theatrics, just quiet orders that send dogs and knives after the trapped musicians. His control makes him scarier than the men carrying out the violence. By the end, the survivors crawl out battered and empty. It doesn't feel like victory, more like escape. The green room, meant to be a place for bands to wait before the music starts, becomes a coffin they barely pry open. Green Room shows that horror doesn't need the supernatural. In 2015, this film proved that sometimes the scariest thing is being trapped with people who see you as expendable. It Comes at Night. 2017 gave us It Comes at Night, a film that proves horror doesn't always need a monster you can see. The story opens with a family secluded in the woods, wearing gas masks and burning a body, their grandfather, who has succumbed to a mysterious illness. Right from the first scene, the rules of this world are clear. Stay isolated, stay cautious, and never let the sickness in. Paul, played by Joel Edgerton, runs his household with military precision. His wife Sarah and teenage son Travis follow strict routines. Doors stay locked, water is rationed, and the red door that leads outside at night is never to be opened. But when another desperate family stumbles across their home, Paul decides to let them in, hoping strength in numbers will mean survival. What follows isn't a battle against the infected, it's a battle against trust. Two families share meals, repair fences, and even laugh together, yet suspicion never disappears. A missing dog, a door left ajar, a sick child. Each moment chips away at the fragile peace. The film never tells us if the illness is outside, inside, or even real in the way we think. What matters is how fear erodes every bond. The horror here isn't in jump scares, but in atmosphere. Long, dimly lit hallways, silence broken by footsteps at night, and Travis's nightmares bleeding into reality all build a sense of dread. When violence finally erupts, it feels inevitable, not sudden. Two families destroying each other because fear leaves no room for trust. It Comes at Night is A24 horror at its starkest. It explains how survival, stripped of community and compassion, turns people into their own worst enemy. The question in the title is never answered, because what comes at night isn't the sickness, it's paranoia, creeping in until nothing human survives. Lamb. In Lamb, released in 2021, A24 took audiences to rural Iceland for one of its strangest horror dramas. The story follows Maria and Ingvar, a couple living alone on their sheep farm, grieving the loss of a child. One spring, during lambing season, they discover something impossible, a newborn that's half human, half lamb. They name her Ada, and instead of recoiling, they decide to raise her as their own daughter. The film plays almost entirely in silence. Wide shots of mountains, sheep in the mist, and endless grasslands give the sense of a world both beautiful and indifferent. The couple's joy in Ada feels tender at first, a second chance at parenthood, but the unease is constant. Maria takes Ada into her arms while a ewe stands outside bleeding as if it knows its child has been stolen. Tension grows when Ingvar's brother arrives. He looks at Ada with disbelief, then disgust, voicing the questions the audience has been holding back. Why are they pretending this is normal? What will happen when nature demands Ada back? His presence shakes the fragile peace in the household, but Maria and Ingvar cling tighter, refusing to let go. The ending is brutal in its simplicity. Ada's true parent, a towering ram-like creature, returns to claim her. Ingvar is killed, Maria is left alone, and the camera lingers on the landscape, empty again except for grief. Lamb doesn't explain his mythology. It doesn't need to. The horror lies in watching love turn into possession, and in the reminder that nature always takes back what it owns. I Saw the TV Glow. Jane Schonbrun's I Saw the TV Glow arrived in 2024 as part of A24's push into surreal horror, though it often feels more like a fever dream than a straightforward genre film. At its heart is Owen, a shy teenager in the suburbs who discovers a late-night TV show called The Pink Opaque. The series, filled with monsters and magical girls, becomes more than entertainment. Owen's connection deepens when he meets Maddie, another teen who shares his obsession. Together they bond over taped episodes, memorized dialogue, and the idea that this fictional show means something larger. But as the years pass, reality and fantasy bleed into each other. Episodes vanish, the show seems to continue in ways Owen can't explain, and his own identity feels trapped between the glowing TV and the dull grayness of his daily life. Visually, the film leans into color and texture. Scenes bathed in pink light contrast with the flat, suffocating tones of suburban homes. The sound design hums with static, like a television never fully tuned, keeping the audience off balance. The horror here lies in the feeling that reality itself is dissolving, and that the safety of fiction is slowly swallowing the real world. By the end, I Saw the TV Glow offers no clear resolution. It leaves Owen lost in his sense of disconnection, still reaching for something that may never have been real. The effect is haunting, not because of violence, but because of the fear that once you slip into fantasy, you may never find your way back. Midsommar. Ari Aster followed Hereditary with Midsommar in 2019, a film that shifts horror into the brightest daylight and still manages to make it unbearable. The story begins in tragedy. Dani, played by Florence Pugh, loses her entire family in a shocking act of violence. Clinging to her boyfriend Christian and his friends, she joins them on a trip to Sweden for a once-in-a-lifetime midsummer festival hosted by a remote commune. At first, it looks idyllic. Flower crowns, dancing, endless sunlight, and rituals that feel strange but harmless. The commune welcomes them with smiles and tradition, insisting everything they do is part of a cycle. But as the visitors settle in, the ceremonies grow more disturbing. An elderly couple leaps from a cliff in a ritual suicide, and the outsiders watch in horror. For the commune, it's natural. Life and death is part of the same cycle. For Dani and her friends, it's a signal that they've wandered into something they don't understand. The tension builds, not through shadows, but through exposure. Every ritual is shot in wide daylight. Every scream drowned out by music and chanting. One by one, Christian's friends vanish into the community's rituals. Christian himself becomes a pawn, drugged and manipulated into taking part in a fertility rite. Dani, still reeling from grief and betrayal, finds herself embraced by the commune, their affection filling the void left by her family. The finale is unforgettable. Christian, paralyzed, is placed inside a bear carcass and burned alive as part of the closing ceremony. Dani watches, wearing a crown of flowers, her face trembling before it breaks into a smile. Whether it's madness or liberation, the ending reframes the entire journey. Grief transformed into belonging, horror reshaped as acceptance. Midsommar explains terror not by hiding it, but by placing it in the sun. It shows how grief can make someone vulnerable to manipulation, and how community, even one built on violence, can feel like salvation to someone desperate for connection. And that brings us to the end of part 1. If you want horror rooted in family tragedy, Hereditary delivers it without compromise. But if you want to see dread build in the middle of the day, Midsommar shows how A24 turned daylight into something terrifying. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, share your favorite A24 horror film in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.